Daniel and Revelation in the 21st Century, Episode 1, Introduction. Over the next 8 to 10 weeks, I want to dive deeply into the books of Daniel and Revelation and look at how both speak extensively about what is happening right now in this 21st century, and particularly how it relates to the modern state of Israel and the surrounding nations of the modern world. One feature that is common to both of these books is that they were addressed to the remnant of Israel while they were in exile in foreign lands. So let's look firstly at the book of Daniel. We see its primary focus is directed towards defining the character of 3 empires that would rule Yehuda during the time they had spent in Eretz-Yisra'el between the return from Babylonian exile until the destruction of the Second Temple. As well as focusing on those 3 empires, both books also point forward towards the 21st century and the modern state of Israel and the events that are leading up to the return of Yeshua. However, those 2 unique periods are considered in a random sequence of visions, which means that both books are set out in such a way that you cannot follow a chronological timeline. Further, there appear to be 2 men in the book of Daniel called by that name. There is a Daniel the prophet, who spent most of his adult life serving the king of Babylon, and finally died and was buried in Susa, in Persia, or modern Iran. His death occurred sometime after the conquest of Babylon by Koresh, Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Persian Empire. The second Daniel was a Cohen, who spent much of his adult life in Persia, and was one who actually returned to Jerusalem with Ezra the scribe, following the completion of the Second Temple. His name is mentioned in the list of Kohanim, or priests, in Ezra chapter 8, verses 1 and 2. So looking firstly at Daniel the prophet, we see that he was the one who was taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babel, at the time of the destruction of the first temple. Then in chapter 2 of Daniel the prophet, who was able to interpret the dream that the king had of a mighty statue made of 4 different metals, and which had feet and toes made of a mixture of iron and clay. The statue in the dream was destroyed by a stone, not cut by human hands, which struck the toes of the statue and caused it to completely disintegrate into dust, while the stone itself became an everlasting kingdom. And Daniel chapter 2 verse 28 says that Daniel was about to interpret the king's dream, and he explains to Nebuchadnezzar that there is a God in heaven who unlocks mysteries, and he is revealing to King Nebuchadnezzar what is going to happen in the acharit-hayamim. The significance of those words is that the events that were seen in the dream did not occur until the acharit-hayamim, which is known, of course, as the time of the end, which I believe is this 21st century in which we are now living. I delivered a series of midweek lectures in 2017, and I referred to the book of Daniel at that stage as God's GPS for the 21st century. The reason is because the timing and fulfillment of the king's dream also is confirmed in the words of Daniel chapter 12, where in verse 4 he was told, "Daniel, keep these words secret, seal up the book until the time of the end. Many will rush here and there, and knowledge will increase." We are now living in just such an era, when knowledge is increasing exponentially year by year, and many people are flying here, there, and everywhere all over the world. Chapter 12 concludes with Daniel being told in verse 13, "Go your way until the end comes, but you will rest and rise for your reward in the end of days." As well as a prophecy shown through the king's dream, Daniel the prophet was also given a number of other visions about the advance of history, particularly as it related to Israel. He was shown how Israel would be ruled over by Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome, following the downfall of Babylon. So we see that the statue in chapter 2 and the final words of encouragement to Daniel in chapter 12 show that the book is clearly out of chronological order. And following the overthrow of Babylon by Koresh, we find that in Ezra chapter 1 verse 2, the words of Koresh himself saying, "Yahweh, the God of heaven, has given me, Koresh, all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house in Jerusalem, in Yehuda." That command from Yahweh was delivered through Koresh to ensure that the people of Yehuda would be well established back in Eretz-Yisra'el when the time came for Yeshua to be born into this world. That leads us on to Daniel the Cohen, who, 114 years after Yehuda had returned to Eretz-Yisra'el, sought to understand why the building of the second temple had not yet been completed. While in residence in Persia, he was praying to Yahweh for guidance as to when the temple would be completed. Daniel's pleadings were justified because even though the foundations had been laid soon after the return, the northern neighbors of Yehuda prevailed on the king of Persia to have the building stopped. So, by the time Daniel the Cohen was praying to Yahweh, 4 generations had passed and no further work had been done on the temple. Then in chapter 9, Daniel the Cohen receives his answer from the angel Gabriel, who had showed him 3 separate time frames. Firstly, in verse 24, the length of the time that the second temple would remain standing was to be 490 years. Then in verses 25 and 26, Gabriel explains how it would be 49 years until the temple building would be completed and Ezra, the prince, would return to the city. Then the city would remain rebuilt for a further 434 years until the Messiah would be cut off, which we now know, of course, refers to Yeshua's death. Finally, in verse 27, the narrative concludes with Gabriel revealing how the first Jewish revolt that brought about the destruction of the second temple would end in 74 CE, with the rebels, zealots, all dying in a suicide pact at Masada. All those latter details were revealed to Daniel the Cohen, who later returned to Eretz-Yisra'el with Ezra the scribe in 396 BCE. Beyond that point, the book of Daniel falls silent until it takes up the story about the 21st century, as we saw earlier in the words of Daniel the prophet and the dream of Nebuchadnezzar. That is a very broad summary of how the book of Daniel spoke of the events relating to the Second Temple period, and how it also speaks about the time in which we are now living. Over the next 8 to 10 weeks, I will dive more deeply into the significance of the words of both the Daniel the prophet and the Cohen. So turning now to the book of Revelation, we see that it rounded out the scriptural narrative of the Brit Hadashah, or New Testament, by addressing and clarifying many of the matters that had only been partially understood throughout the Tanakh and the Brit Hadashah. Just as Yeshua spoke in parables, so also the messages presented by the prophets in the Tanakh left most people, including the Messianic community, with only partial knowledge of what lay ahead for them. and the shattered society of Yehuda was entering into the 2nd century of the Common Era, with most people having to adjust to life in the Hellenistic diaspora. As we saw earlier, Daniel the Cohen had been shown by the angel Gabriel that the Second Temple era would end after 490 years, as foretold in Daniel chapter 9, verse 24. Further, the destruction of the temple would bring an end to 40 years, a 40-year period when the 1st century Messianic community developed, which only began following the death and resurrection of Yeshua. The prophet Ezekiel also foretells when the sojourn of Yehuda in Eretz-Yisra'el would come to an end. As Yahweh said to Ezekiel in chapter 4, verse 6, "You are to lie on your right side and bear the guilt of Yehuda for 40 days. Each day will correspond to a year." The prophetic message of both Daniel and Ezekiel were finally brought to completion with the departure of the Roman armies in 74 CE after the capture of Masada. The people of Yehuda, and particularly the religious establishment who opposed Yeshua, had been given ample time to embrace the Messianic message as it was shared by the 11 original emissaries and Shul, and along with those who'd been called into the Messianic way throughout that 40-year period before the destruction of the temple. Following the withdrawal of the Roman armies in 74 CE, a religious vacuum developed, which appears to have lasted for a whole generation until the message of Revelation was given in 95 CE, that is, 25 years after the destruction of the temple. Therefore, after the opening salutations in Revelation, we find in chapters 2 and 3 a message addressed directly toward the 7 Messianic communities around the western coast of Anatolia, or modern Turkey. Having struggled in this religious vacuum for 25 years after the temple was destroyed, they needed reassurance that their future was safe in their knowledge that they had been called by Yeshua through the Ruach HaKodesh. However, it appears that none of the Messianic community, nor the members of the rest of Yehuda, who had rejected the teachings of Yeshua, knew that it was going to be a very prolonged period of exile. Nobody appeared to be aware that 1900 years would pass before the words of Yeshua would finally be fulfilled. Yeshua's words in Luke chapter 21 verse 24 summarize what they were encountering and gave an indication of just how long that religious hiatus would last, when he said, "Some will fall by the sword, and others will be carried into all the nations of the Goyim," that is, the nations, "and Jerusalem will be trampled down by the Goyim until the age of the Goyim has run its course." Having received the book of Revelation, those who were close to Yeshua would have realized the significance of those words in Luke's Gospel. Only by understanding the message of Revelation would they realize how much had to occur before Yeshua would return. They had seen Jerusalem trampled down, and they also saw how many people in Yehuda had been taken away as slaves into the countries of the Goyim. They still could not comprehend from the words of Revelation that the age of the Goyim would last yet another 1900 years, or 38 Yovels. Not until the Six-Day War of 1967 was the Gentile domination brought to an end. Only then did the sleeping Messianic community finally begin to once again reappear. So in conclusion, we have seen how the books of Daniel and Revelation bridge the gap between the 1st century and the beginning of the 21st century. Only by seeing both books from a Hebraic perspective can we see that we are living in that post-Goyim era, when all that Yeshua had said during his earthly ministry, coupled with the pronouncements made by the prophets of the Tanakh, we can see are beginning to reach their fulfillment in this 21st century. It is the time that both books pointed toward. That is why all that is happening in and around the state of Israel, we need to see it all clearly. We need to dive deeply into the messages of both Daniel and Revelation to be sure that we are seeing the world events in the correct perspective. So during the next 8 to 10 weeks, we will look through, with the aid of the Ruach HaKodesh, how this is all being opened up and unlocked, as Gabriel said to Daniel in chapter 12, that it would be at the time of the end when all these things would be unlocked in both those books. Shabbat Shalom.